I walked in and found my wife kissing her sister's fiancé just a few hours before their wedding. I didn't make a sound, I just stood there, watching. They didn't even notice me. I pulled out my phone and FaceTimed my wife's sister. But then I heard a phone ringing from the corner of the room dash, and I saw my wife's sister standing there. She said, "You need to know something. You know that feeling when your gut's telling you something's off, but your brain keeps insisting you're just being paranoid?" Yeah, well, turns out my gut should have been running my life all along. My name's Marcus Hale, and at 41 years old, I thought I had this whole adulting thing figured out. I'm a builder, the kind of guy who can swing a hammer without breaking his thumb, fix a leaky faucet without flooding the bathroom, and measure twice so I only have to cut once. Been married to Caroline for 17 years, which in today's world basically makes us relationship dinosaurs. We're talking pre-iPhone marriage, people. That's practically prehistoric. This particular Saturday morning should have been like Christmas, and the 4th of July rolled into one. Caroline's younger sister Julia was getting hitched to some hotshot lawyer named Adrian Moore in what was supposed to be the wedding of the century. I'm talking full-blown Cinderella production. White horses, string quartet, the works. My job was simple. Help set up tables, move chairs, smile pretty, and try not to embarrass myself in front of Caroline's hoity-toity relatives who still think I'm not good enough for their precious daughter. But something felt wrong from the moment I rolled out of bed. The house had this weird energy, like when you walk into a room right after people stop talking about you. You know that vibe. Heavy, awkward, loaded with secrets you're not supposed to know about. Caroline had been acting sketchy for weeks, and I kept telling myself it was just wedding stress. Hell, Julia was her baby sister, and Caroline had been micromanaging every detail like she was planning the D-Day invasion. The house was too damn quiet for a morning when we should have been running around like headless chickens. No sound of Caroline's hairdryer, no clatter of coffee mugs, no morning news blaring from the kitchen TV. Just this unsettling silence that made my skin crawl. I padded down the hallway in my boxer shorts and old college t-shirt, calling out for Caroline like some clueless sitcom husband. That's when I heard it. Voices coming from the den. Soft, hushed, the kind of whispers that make your blood pressure spike because you know they're not meant for your ears. My first thought was maybe Caroline was on the phone with the wedding planner, dealing with some last-minute crisis. Maybe the flowers were wrong, or the caterer screwed up, or some bridesmaid had a wardrobe malfunction. Normal wedding drama stuff. I reached for the den door, and that's where my whole world went sideways faster than a trailer in a tornado. I opened that door, and I froze. Not the kind of freeze where you're surprised or startled. The kind where your entire nervous system just shuts down and refuses to process what your eyes are showing you. My wife Caroline, the woman I'd been sharing a bed with for 17 years, was pressed up against Adrian Moore like they were starring in some R-rated movie. And we're not talking about a friendly hug or a congratulatory peck on the cheek. This was full contact, hands tangled in hair, bodies pressed together kissing. The kind that makes you want to get a room, or at least check the ratings on whatever channel you accidentally stumbled onto. Adrian Moore, Julia's fiancé, the guy who was supposed to be marrying Caroline's little sister in less than 6 hours, had his hands all over my wife like he owned the damn place. Caroline was making these little sounds that I hadn't heard in years, certainly not directed at me. Her fingers were gripping the back of his neck like she was drowning, and he was her life preserver. My brain completely short-circuited. I mean, what the hell do you do in a situation like that? There's no handbook for what to do when you catch your wife making out with your future brother-in-law on the morning of his wedding. Hallmark doesn't make cards for that particular life event. I didn't breathe. Couldn't breathe. My lungs just stopped working like someone had unplugged them from the wall. My knuckles went white around my phone. Apparently, my hands had grabbed it without my brain's permission. The screen was lit up, and I realized I'd been about to call Caroline to ask where she was. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so damn devastating. Standing there like a statue, I couldn't help but notice the details my contractor brain was cataloging against my will. The way Adrian's expensive suit jacket was wrinkled from Caroline's grabbing hands. How her makeup was smudged just slightly around the edges. Makeup she'd spent an hour perfecting for her sister's wedding photos. The fact that they were doing this in our den, surrounded by family photos and the couch where Caroline and I used to watch Netflix together. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, it was how natural they looked together. Like this wasn't their first rodeo, if you catch my drift. There was a familiarity in the way they moved, a rhythm that spoke of practice. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment mistake or a wedding stress breakdown. This was choreographed, rehearsed, routine. My phone buzzed in my death grip, some notification that might as well have been a fire alarm for how much it startled me. But they were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice. Caroline whispered Adrian's name like it was a prayer, like she'd been practicing it, savoring it. The same voice she used to whisper my name, back when we still had those kinds of moments. Standing there in my ratty boxers and college t-shirt, watching my wife betray not just me, but her own sister, I felt like the biggest fool who ever walked the earth. 17 years of marriage, and I'd been living with a stranger. A woman who could smile at breakfast, help me plan our future, then sneak around with the guy who was supposed to become family in a few hours. The builder in me wanted to assess the damage, figure out what could be salvaged and what needed to be torn down completely. But the husband in me was drowning in a cocktail of rage, humiliation, and heartbreak that tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. They still hadn't noticed me standing there like a deer in headlights, which somehow made it worse. I was invisible in my own house, watching my own life implode in real time, while the two people who were supposed to love and respect me treated me like furniture. That's when I knew my gut had been right all along. Something was definitely wrong in the House of Hale, and it was about to get a whole lot wrong. Chapter 2, The Silent Witness. They still hadn't noticed me standing there like some kind of perverted statue in a really twisted museum exhibit. I guess when you're busy playing tonsil hockey with someone who isn't your spouse, peripheral vision becomes optional. Adrian's hands were tangled in Caroline's hair. The same hair I used to brush when she was sick. The same hair that used to smell like vanilla and now probably smelled like lies and cheap cologne. Caroline whispered his name again, Adrian, like she was tasting expensive wine instead of destroying 2 marriages and a family. She said it with this breathiness that made my stomach do gymnastics routines I didn't sign up for. The way she owned that name, rolled it around in her mouth like she'd been practicing. It made me want to punch something, preferably Adrian's perfectly straight teeth. My phone was still clutched in my white-knuckled grip, and my thumb started moving like it had a mind of its own. One click and I could FaceTime Julia, show her exactly what kind of Prince Charming she was about to marry. My finger hovered over her contact like I was defusing a bomb. Which, let's be honest, I basically was. Julia's face would fill my screen, all bright and happy and trusting, probably already getting her makeup done for the biggest day of her life that was about to become the worst day of her life. The sick part of my brain started imagining the conversation. Hey Julia, sorry to interrupt your wedding prep, but your sister's currently making out with your fiancé in my den. Want me to get a better angle for the video? Yeah, that'd go over real well. Nothing says family bonding like destroying someone's world via smartphone. But then something made me freeze up even more than I already was, which I didn't think was physically possible. From somewhere in the far corner of the room, another phone started ringing. Not the generic iPhone ringtone. This was Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles, Julia's signature ringtone that she'd had since high school because she said it reminded her that every day was a fresh start. I turned toward the sound like a robot with rusty joints, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Julia was standing there, not on my phone screen where she should have been, getting her hair done and being blissfully ignorant. In the actual room, in the flesh, eyes red and puffy like she'd been crying, still clutching her wedding dress to her chest like a shield. Marcus, she said quietly, and her voice had this quality I'd never heard before, like broken glass wrapped in velvet. Not loud enough to interrupt the Caroline and Adrian show, but clear enough to cut through my shock. You need to know something. My brain did this weird stuttering thing where it couldn't decide which crisis to focus on. Here I was, catching my wife cheating, and now Julia, sweet, innocent Julia who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, was standing there looking like someone had just told her Santa Claus was actually a registered sex offender. The timing was so ridiculous it would have been funny if it wasn't so goddamn tragic. It was like we were all actors in some twisted soap opera, except nobody had given us the script, and we were all improvising our way through hell. Julia's eyes weren't on me anymore. They were locked on her sister and her fiancé, who were still going at it like they were trying to win some kind of Olympic medal for adultery. Her face had this expression I'd never seen before, like she was watching a nature documentary about predators eating their young. Fascinated and horrified at the same time. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the awful silence that seemed to surround us like a force field. But what do you say? Sorry you had to see this. Well, this is awkward. At least the wedding cake won't go to waste. My mouth felt like it was full of sawdust and broken promises. Julia's dress was this gorgeous ivory creation that probably cost more than my truck. All delicate lace and tiny buttons that would take an engineering degree to figure out. She was holding it like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and I realized she'd probably been coming to get ready at our house like they planned. Caroline was supposed to help her into the dress, do that whole sisterly bonding thing that women do before weddings. Instead, Julia got a front row seat to the Caroline and Adrian Variety Hour, featuring betrayal, deception, and a complete disregard for basic human decency. Talk about your wedding day surprises. The whole scene was so surreal, I kept waiting for someone to yell, "Cut!" and tell us it was all just a really elaborate prank. But Adrian kept whispering sweet nothings in Caroline's ear. Caroline kept making those little sounds that used to be reserved for me. And Julia kept standing there like a wedding dress-wielding ghost of Christmas future. I found myself studying Julia's face, looking for signs of what she was thinking. She'd always been the emotional one in the family, the one who cried at commercials and cheered for the underdog in every movie. But right now, she looked eerily calm, like she was doing complex math in her head or planning someone's murder. Maybe both. The worst part was how ordinary the room looked otherwise. Same family photos on the mantle, same stupid throw pillows Caroline insisted on buying at every home goods store in a 50-mile radius. Same coffee table with the ring stains from where I forgot to use coasters. Everything exactly the same, except for the two people destroying lives in the middle of it all. My legs started feeling like overcooked spaghetti, and I had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling over. This was supposed to be Julia's perfect day, the day she'd been planning since she was 5 years old and decided she wanted to marry a prince. Instead, she was getting a masterclass in how the people you trust most can gut you like a fish without even having the decency to look sorry about it. Julia's breathing was shallow and controlled, like she was trying not to hyperventilate. Join the club, sweetheart. My own lungs felt like they were having an argument with my ribcage about whether or not they wanted to keep working. The irony was thicker than Caroline's makeup. Here we were, 3 people whose lives were imploding in real time, while the 2 people causing the implosion were completely oblivious to their audience. It was like being trapped in the world's most uncomfortable reality show, except instead of winning money, we all got to have our hearts ripped out on live television. Julia's eyes met mine across the room, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just heartbreak or shock, it was recognition. Like she'd been expecting this, or at least expecting something like this. Like maybe she'd already known more than she was letting on. Hashtag Chapter 3, Julia's Revelation. Julia didn't scream. She didn't throw her wedding dress at them like some kind of lace projectile. She didn't even clear her throat to announce her presence, which honestly would have been my first move. Instead, she walked past me with this eerie calm that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like I was watching a horror movie and the killer was about to make their grand entrance. She moved across the room like she was floating, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor I'd installed myself 3 summers ago. When she reached the happy couple, and man, does that phrase taste like battery acid now, she just stood there and stared at them. Her lips were trembling, but her voice came out steady as a rock when she finally spoke. "How long?" she asked. Just 2 words, but they hit the room like a grenade going off in a library. Adrian jumped back from Caroline so fast you'd think she'd suddenly caught fire. His face went through about 6 different shades of pale before settling on, "Oh shit, I'm so screwed," white. Caroline spun around with her mouth hanging open like a broken mailbox, and for a second, nobody said anything. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. Adrian started stammering like a broken car engine trying to turn over. "Julia, we were just, this isn't what it looks like." And I'm thinking, really, dude? You're gonna go with "this isn't what it looks like" when your tongue was practically doing the tango with her sister's tonsils 5 seconds ago? That's the best legal mind money can buy. Caroline bit her lip so hard I thought she might draw blood, and she got that deer in headlights look that meant her brain was running through every possible excuse at light speed. I'd seen that expression before, usually right before she told me the credit card bill was higher than expected because of unexpected expenses. But nobody answered Julia's question. Not a damn word. They just stood there looking guilty as sin and twice as stupid, like two kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar, except the cookie jar was someone's marriage and the cookies were made of pure betrayal. Julia turned to me then, and I swear to God, her eyes looked about 20 years older than they had 5 minutes ago. "Marcus," she said, and her voice had this quality that made my stomach drop into my work boots. "You've been living in a lie too." My heart started doing this weird, thudding thing, like it was trying to escape through my throat. What the hell did that mean? I thought I was just the unlucky bastard who walked in on his wife's extramarital activities. But Julia's expression suggested this rabbit hole went a lot deeper than I'd thought. She pulled out her phone with hands that weren't quite steady, and I noticed her engagement ring catching the morning light. The same ring Adrian had probably picked out while planning to screw around with her sister. The irony was so thick it was practically choking me. What she showed me on that phone screen made my knees buckle like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. Text messages. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. All between Caroline and Adrian, and they went back months. Not weeks, not days, months. This wasn't some recent development or a moment of weakness. This was a full-blown relationship that had been happening under everyone's noses. The messages were detailed, and I mean the kind of detailed that makes you wish you'd never learned to read. Hotel room numbers, meetup times, inside jokes that made me want to punch through a wall. There were screenshots of bank statements showing cash withdrawals that Caroline had somehow hidden from our joint account. Photos that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing because it was too damn much to handle. It wasn't a fling, Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow loud enough to fill the entire room. It was an affair. A whole second relationship happening right under your roof, Marcus. I felt like someone had just told me that gravity was optional and the sky was actually green. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my wife, all of it was apparently just carefully constructed bullshit designed to keep me in the dark while they played house behind my back. Caroline finally found her voice, and when she did, it came out like a squeaky toy being stepped on. "Julia, honey, you don't understand." "Don't." Julia's voice cut through Caroline's attempted explanation like a hot knife through butter. "Don't you dare call me honey. Don't you dare try to explain this away like it's some kind of misunderstanding." The worst part was reading the timestamps on those messages. Date nights when Caroline said she was out with girlfriends. She was with Adrian. Weekend work conferences that I thought were legitimate. Hotel room rendezvous. The time she said she was helping Julia with wedding planning. Apparently, wedding planning was code for playing hide the salami with the groom. I scrolled through more messages, each one feeling like a small knife being twisted in my gut. Caroline complaining about me to Adrian. Adrian promising her they'd be together once he handled the Julia situation. Caroline talking about our bedroom life like it was some kind of joke they shared. The business trips Adrian claimed he was taking for work. Half of them were romantic getaways with my wife. The cash withdrawals weren't for wedding expenses like Caroline had told me. They were funding hotel rooms and fancy dinners that I wasn't invited to. Julia's phone buzzed with a notification, and I saw the name at the top of her screen. Private investigator, Sarah Chun. My brain did another one of those stuttering things as I realized Julia hadn't just stumbled onto this information. She'd been building a case. "You hired a PI?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than a gravel road. Julia nodded, and for the first time since she'd walked into this nightmare, I saw a flash of the sharp intelligence that had gotten her through law school before she decided to become a teacher instead. 3 weeks ago, I started noticing things. Caroline's sudden interest in my wedding details, Adrian's strange schedule changes, the way they looked at each other during family dinners. Sweet, naive Julia wasn't so naive after all. She'd been playing detective while the rest of us were playing house, and she'd uncovered enough evidence to bury both Caroline and Adrian in a scandal that would make the evening news look boring. The wedding was only hours away, less than 6, to be exact, but Julia wasn't talking about canceling it. Not yet, anyway, and that scared the hell out of me more than anything else that had happened in the last 20 minutes, which was saying something considering I'd just watched my entire life get flushed down the toilet like yesterday's fish dinner. "We're not calling it off," Julia said, and her voice had this steely quality that I'd never heard before. This wasn't the same woman who used to cry during those Sarah McLachlan commercials about abused animals. This was someone who'd been forged in fire and come out the other side made of pure determination and righteous fury. Caroline and Adrian were still standing there like deer caught in headlights, probably trying to figure out if they could somehow talk their way out of this mess. Good luck with that, folks. When you're caught red-handed with enough evidence to convict you in federal court, smooth talking isn't going to cut it. Julia turned to me, and I could see her building up to something that was going to knock me on my ass even more than I already was. "Marcus, you need to know that Caroline's been undermining me for years. This affair? It's just the latest chapter in a very long book of sisterly betrayal." My brain was already running on fumes from processing the adultery revelation, but Julia wasn't done dropping bombs on my psychological landscape. She pulled up more files on her phone, emails, text messages, recorded phone calls that made my blood pressure spike like a rocket heading for orbit. Caroline's been whispering to our parents, to our aunts and uncles, to anyone who'd listen that I was too soft, too naive to handle a real relationship. Julia continued, scrolling through what looked like years of documented backstabbing. She convinced Aunt Meredith that I needed guidance choosing a husband. She told Mom and Dad that I was making a mistake rushing into marriage. The pieces started clicking together like some kind of twisted jigsaw puzzle. Caroline's sudden interest in Julia's relationship, the way she'd inserted herself into every wedding decision, her insistence on helping with everything from the guest list to the flower arrangements. I'd thought she was being a supportive big sister. Turns out she was playing the long game, positioning herself to swoop in and steal the groom. "She's been working on Adrian for months," Julia said, her fingers flying across her phone screen like she was conducting a symphony of evidence. "Telling him I was immature, that I'd never understand his political ambitions, that he needed someone more sophisticated. Adrian had finally found his voice, and when he used it, he sounded like a politician who'd just been caught taking bribes from the mob. Julia, you have to understand, this wasn't planned. It just happened." "Bullshit." Julia's voice cut through his excuse like a chainsaw through balsa wood. "Nothing just happens for 6 months, Adrian. You don't accidentally book hotel rooms. You don't accidentally withdraw cash to hide your tracks. You don't accidentally promise my sister a partnership while promising me a marriage." Partnership. That word hit me like a brick to the face. Adrian wasn't just screwing around with Caroline. He was offering her something he'd never offered Julia. A real relationship, a future, a place in his carefully planned political career. Julia was supposed to be the trophy wife, the sweet teacher who'd look good in campaign photos. Caroline was the one he actually wanted by his side. The worst part was seeing Caroline's face during all this. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't even trying to look sorry. She had this expression like she'd been caught cheating on a test she thought she deserved to pass anyway. Like the rules didn't apply to her because she was older, smarter, more deserving of the life Julia had built for herself. "You promised Julia a partnership too, didn't you, Caroline?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than sandpaper. All those late-night, wedding planning sessions were really job interviews for the position of Adrian's real wife. Caroline's silence was answer enough. She'd been auditioning to replace her own sister, studying Julia's relationship like it was a role she wanted to steal, learning Adrian's preferences, his ambitions, his weaknesses, then positioning herself as the better choice. Julia's eyes burned into mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was being X-rayed. "I need your help, Marcus. If we do this wrong, they'll walk away clean. Caroline will play the victim, say she was seduced by a man who was using her. Adrian will claim it was all Caroline's idea, that she pursued him. They'll spin this so they both come out looking like casualties instead of conspirators." She was right, and I hated that she was right. Adrian was a lawyer with political connections. Caroline was a master manipulator who'd been playing this game longer than Julia had been alive. If we just exposed them now, they'd find a way to turn themselves into the victims of their own scheme. "But if we do this right," Julia continued, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes like she was planning a military campaign. "Everyone sees who they really are. Everyone sees what they've been doing, not just to us, but to our entire family. To the people who trusted them, believed in them, supported them. My wife's betrayal had shattered me like a dropped mirror, but Julia's courage was starting to anchor me to something solid. Here was a woman who'd had her entire future stolen by the two people she trusted most, and instead of falling apart, she was strategizing. Instead of running away, she was preparing for war. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Maybe some of Julia's steel was rubbing off on me. She smiled then, and it was the most terrifying smile I'd ever seen. Not because it was mean or cruel, but because it was absolutely certain. Julia had moved past the shock and pain and landed squarely in the realm of calculated justice. "I need you to help me give them exactly what they deserve," she said, in front of everyone they've been lying to. Chapter 5, The Gathering Storm. By noon, Riverside Estate looked like something straight out of a fairy tale, the kind where the princess gets her happily ever after, and everyone lives in blissful ignorance of the corruption rotting away at the kingdom's core. The Hale and Moore families had descended on the venue like well-dressed locusts, transforming the sprawling grounds into what probably cost more than my annual salary. Crystal chandeliers hung from every available surface, casting rainbow prisms across white silk draping that fluttered in the September breeze like expensive ghosts. The champagne was already chilling in silver buckets that probably cost more than my truck, and a string quartet was running through their rehearsals near the Rose Garden where Julia was supposed to pledge her life to a lying sack of garbage in a designer tuxedo. Guests were arriving in their BMWs and Mercedes, stepping out in suits that cost more than most people's rent and gowns that looked like they'd been personally blessed by fashion angels. The parking area looked like a luxury car dealership had exploded, with enough combined horsepower to power a small city and enough combined net worth to buy one. The whole scene was so picture-perfect it made my teeth hurt. White roses everywhere, gold accents catching the sunlight, servers in crisp uniforms carrying trays of champagne flutes, and those tiny appetizers that rich people pretend are actual food. It was the kind of wedding that would make the society pages and give other brides massive inferiority complexes for the next decade. But I knew what was coming. Julia and I had spent the last few hours planning what she called the unveiling, and I was starting to feel like I was about to watch a controlled demolition. Beautiful on the outside, but everyone inside was about to get buried in the rubble. Caroline floated through the halls of the estate like she was auditioning for the role of perfect sister-in-law in some twisted play. She'd changed into this flowing designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and she was working the crowd like a politician's wife at a fundraiser, hugging elderly relatives, complimenting other women's outfits, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. The whole performance was so flawless it was nauseating. What really got to me was watching her with Julia's friends and family members. She'd lean in close to Julia's college roommates and whisper things that made them nod sympathetically. She'd pat Aunt Meredith's arm and make concerned faces while talking about supporting Julia through this transition. The woman was literally comforting people about concerns she'd planted in their heads in the first place. I caught snippets of her conversations as I moved through the crowd, pretending to help with last-minute setup, while actually gathering intelligence for Julia's master plan. Caroline was telling Julia's grandmother that she was worried Julia might be rushing things. She confided to Cousin Beth that Adrian seemed overwhelmed by Julia's emotional needs. Every conversation was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as sisterly concern. Meanwhile, Adrian was working his side of the room like the political animal he was born to be. The guy had this way of making every conversation sound like he was running for office, which, knowing his ambitions, he probably would be in a few years. He was shaking hands with Julia's father, promising him they'd take good care of his daughter while probably planning to trade her in for her sister as soon as the ink dried on the marriage certificate. I watched him schmooze with Victor Moore, his father, who looked like he'd been carved out of marble and expensive scotch. The old man was a retired senator, and you could tell he'd passed on the family tradition of being ruthlessly charming while secretly calculating how every interaction could benefit him politically. Victor kept introducing Adrian to other guests as my son, the future congressman, like the kid had already won an election instead of just planning to destroy two families before appetizers were served. Camille Moore, Adrian's mother, was holding court near the champagne fountain, dispensing social wisdom to anyone within earshot, while looking like she'd been dipped in diamonds and preserved in ice. She had this way of complimenting people that somehow made them feel inferior, like telling Julia's aunt that her dress was so brave and commenting on how refreshing it was to see someone embrace their natural gray hair. The guest list read like a who's who of people with more money than sense and enough social standing to make or break reputations with a well-placed whisper. State representatives, federal judges, business executives, and enough old money to fund a small country's GDP. These weren't the kind of people you embarrassed lightly. They had the power to make your life very difficult if you crossed them. But that was exactly why Julia's plan was so brilliant. These people valued reputation above everything else. Their entire social structure was built on maintaining appearances and preserving the illusion of moral superiority. What we were about to do would shatter that illusion like a sledgehammer through a stained glass window. Dr. Owen Clark, the family friend who was supposed to officiate the ceremony, was wandering around with this beatific smile that made him look like a golden retriever who'd found a tennis ball factory. The guy was genuinely excited to be marrying off two people he thought were perfect for each other, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to become an unwitting participant in the most spectacular wedding disaster since someone invented the phrase, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." I found myself studying the other guests, wondering how many of them had secrets of their own hidden behind their designer facades. The congressman's wife, who kept checking her phone for messages from someone who definitely wasn't her husband. The federal judge who'd had 3 martinis before 2 o'clock and was getting handsy with the catering staff. The business executive who was making deals during what was supposed to be a family celebration. Maybe that was why Caroline and Adrian thought they could get away with their scheme. In a crowd full of people hiding their own skeletons, what was one more closet full of bones? Julia appeared at my elbow like a designer-clad ghost, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. She'd been getting ready in one of the estate's guest suites, and seeing her in her wedding dress for the first time hit me like a punch to the solar plexus. She looked absolutely radiant, but there was something different about her smile. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like watching a sunrise right before a hurricane. "How are we doing?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the string quartet's rendition of some classical piece that probably had a name I couldn't pronounce. "Caroline's working the crowd like a pro," I reported, keeping my voice low even though we were surrounded by enough background noise to cover a small explosion. "She's got half your relatives convinced that you're making a mistake, and the other half thinking she's the most supportive sister in the history of family relationships." Julia nodded, her expression serene in a way that would have been reassuring if I didn't know what was coming. "And Adrian? Playing politician with everyone who has a pulse and a voting record," I said. "His parents are eating it up, and your dad looks like he's ready to campaign for the guy personally." We stood there for a moment, watching the elaborate dance of social interaction play out around us. Guests were mingling, servers were serving, musicians were musicianing, and everyone was completely oblivious to the fact that they were about to witness a spectacular implosion that would be talked about for generations. "You sure about this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the steel in her eyes. Julia's smile widened, and for a second, I saw a flash of the woman she was becoming. Someone who'd been forged in betrayal and emerged stronger, smarter, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting herself and the people she loved. "Marcus," she said, adjusting her veil with hands that were steadier than mine had been all day. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That's when I knew we weren't just going to expose Caroline and Adrian. We were going to absolutely destroy them in front of everyone who mattered, and Julia was going to look like a queen while she did it. The wedding was set to begin in less than 4 hours, and I could already feel the storm gathering. Julia wasn't just sharp as glass. She was a whole damn window factory, and she'd been manufacturing evidence while everyone else was picking out boutonnieres and arguing over seating charts. While I'd been playing the clueless husband and Caroline had been playing the devoted sister, Julia had been playing chess on a board the rest of us didn't even know existed. The AV technician was this skinny kid named Danny who looked like he'd rather be setting up sound equipment for a death metal concert than a society wedding. He had more piercings than a pincushion and tattoos that probably told the story of every bad decision he'd made since puberty. But the kid knew his stuff, and more importantly, he didn't ask questions when Julia slipped him a USB drive along with a tip that was probably bigger than his monthly rent. Just plug it in when I give you the signal, Julia had told him earlier, her voice sweet as pie and twice as dangerous. The presentation will run automatically. Don't stop it no matter what anyone says. Danny had nodded like she'd just asked him to play Here Comes the Bride, instead of essentially asking him to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of high society's biggest party of the year. The kid was either really professional or really didn't care about the drama he was about to unleash. Either way, he was our guy. The USB drive contained everything Julia's private investigator had dug up over the past 3 weeks, plus some additional materials that Julia had gathered herself with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would have impressed the FBI. Screenshots of text messages, hotel receipts, bank statements, photos that ranged from damning to downright pornographic, and video footage from security cameras that showed Caroline and Adrian in situations that definitely weren't covered in any sister-in-law handbook. But the real masterpiece was the timeline Julia had created. Month by month, week by week, sometimes day-by-day documentation of how Caroline had systematically undermined Julia's relationship while building her own with Adrian. It read like a psychological thriller written by someone with a PhD in manipulation and a minor in pure evil. My job was simple in theory, complicated as hell in practice. Keep Caroline calm and unsuspecting until the moment Julia was ready to drop the hammer. This meant smiling at my cheating wife, making small talk about flower arrangements, and pretending I didn't know she'd been playing hide the salami with the groom for the better part of a year. "You look beautiful today," I told Caroline as she adjusted her dress for the 100th time, checking her reflection in every mirror and shiny surface like she was preparing for her close-up. Which, in a way, she was, just not the kind she was expecting. She beamed at me with that radiant smile that used to make my heart skip beats and now just made my stomach churn. "Thank you, honey. I want everything to be perfect for Julia's big day." The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. Caroline wanting Julia's day to be perfect while simultaneously planning to steal the groom was like an arsonist offering to help with fire safety. But I smiled and nodded like the good, clueless husband I was supposed to be. "Have you seen Adrian?" she asked, and there was something in her voice. A little breathiness, a hint of anticipation, that made me want to throttle someone. Preferably Adrian, but Caroline was running a close second. "He's making the rounds with his father," I said, which was true. Victor Moore had Adrian working the crowd like they were campaigning for office instead of celebrating a wedding. Politician in training, that one. Caroline's eyes got this dreamy look that I recognized from our early dating days. Except now it was aimed at someone else entirely. "He's going to do such important work," she said, and I could practically hear her mentally rewriting her future from Marcus's wife to Congressman Moore's wife. Meanwhile, Julia was handling her side of the operation with the kind of cool precision that would have made James Bond jealous. She was getting ready in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids who were completely oblivious to the fact that their friend was about to orchestrate the most spectacular revenge plot in wedding history. I checked in on her an hour ago, and she was sitting in front of the mirror while her maid of honor fussed with her hair, looking calm as a summer morning. But when our eyes met in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood pressure spike. Pure, calculated determination wrapped in white lace and pearls. "How are you holding up?" I'd asked, which was probably the stupidest question in the history of human communication. The woman had just discovered her sister was sleeping with her fiancé, and I was asking how she was holding up like she had a case of pre-wedding jitters. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she'd answered. And the way she said it made me understand that Julia wasn't just planning to expose Caroline and Adrian. She was planning to destroy them so completely that they'd never recover from the fallout. The ceremony was set for 4 o'clock, which gave us about 2 hours to get everyone in position. The guests were already starting to take their seats in the rose garden, chattering excitedly about the beautiful day and the perfect couple. If they only knew they were about to witness the wedding equivalent of the Hindenburg disaster. I found myself studying Adrian as he worked the crowd, and I had to admit the bastard was good at what he did. He had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room, at least until he moved on to the next mark. He was telling Julia's uncle about his plans for criminal justice reform while probably planning to commit fraud on a massive scale. The guy could sell ice to Eskimos and make them feel good about the purchase. But what really got to me was watching him with Julia's family. He was playing the devoted fiancé so perfectly that even I might have bought it if I hadn't seen him with his tongue down Caroline's throat a few hours ago. He hugged Julia's grandmother, complimented her cooking, promised to take good care of her granddaughter, all while planning to trade her in for the sister model as soon as possible. The wedding party was starting to gather for photos, and I could see the stress beginning to show around the edges of everyone's perfect facades. Caroline kept checking her phone, probably hoping for a last-minute text from Adrian. Julia's bridesmaids were fussing over every detail, making sure the day would be absolutely perfect. The groomsmen were already sampling the open bar, because apparently standing around in fancy suits was thirsty work. Dr. Owen Clark was reviewing his notes for the ceremony, probably going over the vows that Adrian was about to make while lying through his perfectly capped teeth. The old guy was so genuinely excited about marrying two people he thought were perfect for each other that I almost felt bad about what was coming. Almost. As 4 o'clock approached, I could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. Julia was about to walk down that aisle in front of everyone who mattered, and instead of saying, "I do," she was going to say, "I know exactly what you did, you lying piece of garbage." I caught Adrian's eye across the crowd and smiled at him, knowing it might be the last friendly expression he ever got from anyone in this family. He smiled back, probably thinking he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. He had no idea that in less than an hour, his entire world was going to come crashing down around his ears, and it was going to be broadcast in high definition to everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. 4 o'clock hit like a gavel in a courtroom, and suddenly everyone was moving with the kind of choreographed precision that only happens at weddings and military operations. Guests were filing into their seats in the rose garden, adjusting their designer outfits and checking their phones one last time before the main event. The late September sun was hitting the scene just right, casting everything in that golden light that photographers kill for and brides dream about. The string quartet launched into some classical number that probably had a name longer than my grocery list, and I found myself positioned near the back with the other supportive family members who didn't rate seats in the front row. From here, I had a perfect view of the whole operation, the guests settling into their chairs like well-dressed vultures, the wedding party taking their positions like actors in a play that was about to go completely off-script. Caroline was sitting in the front row, right where the sister of the bride was supposed to sit, looking like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She'd chosen this soft blue dress that made her look innocent and supportive, the perfect picture of the devoted older sister who just wanted her baby sister to be happy. If I didn't know better, I might have bought the act myself. Hell, 3 hours ago I had bought the act. She kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing up the emotional sister routine for everyone around her. Aunt Meredith kept patting her arm sympathetically, probably thinking Caroline was just overwhelmed with happiness for Julia. If only the old lady knew that Caroline's tears were probably from the stress of keeping her lies straight, not from sisterly joy. Victor Moore was holding court in the second row, surrounded by what looked like half the state legislature and a federal judge or two. The old politician was in his element, shaking hands and making small talk about campaign contributions and judicial appointments. To him, this wedding was just another networking opportunity, a chance to show off his son's prize catch and expand his political influence. Camille Moore sat beside her husband like an ice sculpture dressed in Chanel, her expression somewhere between gracious and constipated. She'd probably spent more on her outfit than most people spend on their cars, and she wore it like armor against the common folk who dared to breathe the same air as the Moore family dynasty. The groomsmen were lined up at the altar looking like a catalog for expensive bad decisions. Adrian stood at the center, adjusted his tie for probably the 15th time, and flashed that $1 million smile that had probably gotten him out of more trouble than a diplomatic immunity card. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man who was about to marry the woman of his dreams instead of settling for second choice, while planning to upgrade to the sister model as soon as legally possible. Dr. Owen Clark took his position at the altar with his worn leather Bible and that beatific smile that made him look like he'd been personally blessed by wedding angels. The guy was genuinely excited to be marrying two people he thought were perfect for each other, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to become the unwitting officiant at the most spectacular relationship disaster since someone invented the phrase, "till death do us part." The music shifted, and I felt my stomach drop into my work boots. This was it, showtime. The bridesmaids started their procession down the aisle, each one looking like they'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. They moved in perfect synchronization, flowers perfectly positioned, smiles radiating the kind of joy that only comes from getting to wear a pretty dress and eat free food while watching someone else make a huge life decision. Julia's maid of honor, her college roommate Sarah, brought up the rear of the bridesmaid parade. I'd known Sarah for years, and she was usually the type who could spot drama from 3 counties away. But today she looked blissfully unaware that she was about to witness the wedding equivalent of a nuclear meltdown. She caught my eye and smiled, probably thinking I was just another proud family member getting emotional about the big day. Then the music changed again, and every head in the garden turned toward the back of the aisle. Here comes the bride, all dressed in white, and carrying enough explosive evidence to level half the state's political establishment. Julia appeared at the far end of the aisle like something out of a fairy tale, if fairy tales included revenge plots and systematic destruction of lying scumbags. Her dress was this flowing creation that probably cost more than my truck, all delicate lace and tiny pearls that caught the sunlight like stars. Her veil billowed behind her in the gentle breeze, and she carried a bouquet of white roses that looked innocent enough to fool everyone who didn't know what was coming. But I could see the difference. Where other brides looked nervous or excited or overwhelmed, Julia looked focused. Her smile was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like watching a sunrise right before a hurricane. She moved down that aisle with the kind of purpose that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and being completely at peace with the consequences. The guests were all standing now, turning to watch the bride make her grand entrance. I heard the usual wedding murmurs, compliments about her dress, comments about how radiant she looked, speculation about how perfect she and Adrian were together. If they only knew they were about to find out exactly how perfect Adrian really was. Caroline was crying again, but from my angle, I could see something in her expression that made my blood run cold. She wasn't crying from joy or sisterly pride. She was crying because she knew this was probably the last time she'd ever see Julia look at her with anything other than complete disgust and betrayal. Adrian's face when he saw Julia walking toward him was a masterpiece of conflicted emotions. He was smiling that practiced politician smile, but there was something in his eyes, maybe guilt, maybe calculation, maybe just the realization that he was about to promise his life to one woman while planning to spend it with another. For a split second, he looked less like a confident groom and more like a man walking to his own execution. Julia reached the altar with the kind of grace that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a game where everyone else thinks they're playing checkers. Dr. Owen beamed at her like she was his own daughter, and Adrian stepped forward to take her hand with all the enthusiasm of someone accepting a subpoena. "Dearly beloved, Dr. Owen began, his voice carrying across the garden with the authority of someone who'd performed this ceremony hundreds of times. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Julia and Adrian in holy matrimony." Holy matrimony. The irony was so thick I could have built a house with it. There was nothing holy about what Adrian had been doing with Caroline, and the only thing getting united today was going to be the entire guest list in their shared shock and horror. Dr. Owen continued with the traditional opening, talking about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage while Adrian stood there probably calculating his exit strategy, and Julia stood there looking like an angel of vengeance wrapped in white silk. "Marriage is a sacred institution," Dr. Owen intoned, "built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Trust, honesty, and mutual respect. 3 things that Adrian had about as much of as a politician had integrity, which is to say absolutely none. The ceremony progressed through the traditional readings and prayers, each word seeming to echo with ironic significance. When Dr. Owen talked about forsaking all others, I saw Adrian's jaw tighten slightly. When he mentioned honoring and cherishing, I caught Caroline shifting uncomfortably in her seat. When he spoke about the bonds that should never be broken, Julia's smile got a little sharper around the edges. Finally, Dr. Owen reached the moment that every wedding guest was waiting for, The part that would either seal the deal or blow everything to pieces. His voice carried across the silent garden as he asked the question that had probably been used to expose cheating spouses since weddings were invented. If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The garden went completely silent. Not just quiet. Silent in that way that only happens when 200 people all hold their breath at exactly the same time. Even the birds seemed to pause their singing, like they knew something big was about to happen. That's when Julia raised her hand. Not dramatically, not with a flourish, just a simple, elegant gesture that somehow commanded the attention of every person in that garden. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong and absolutely certain. A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. This wasn't how weddings were supposed to go. Brides didn't object to their own marriages. There was probably some kind of rule against it in the wedding handbook. But Julia wasn't done. She turned, not to Adrian, not to Dr. Owen, not even to the confused guests, but directly to the crowd of people who'd known her since she was born, who'd watched her grow up, who'd celebrated every milestone of her life. "Before I vow my life to this man," she said, her voice carrying across the garden like a bell tolling for the dead, "you all deserve to see who he truly is." And that's when Danny, the AV technician, bless his pierced and tattooed heart, flipped the switch that was about to turn this society wedding into the most spectacular train wreck in the history of high-class entertainment. The screen that had been set up for the wedding slideshow, you know, the kind that usually shows baby pictures and awkward prom photos, suddenly lit up like the 4th of July. Except instead of fireworks, we got front row seats to the Adrian and Caroline variety show. And let me tell you, it was a performance that would have made Hollywood producers weep with envy. The first image that popped up was a text message thread, blown up large enough for even Aunt Meredith's ancient eyes to read from the back row. Adrian's contact name in Caroline's phone wasn't future brother-in-law or Julia's fiancé. It was "my love" with a heart emoji that made my stomach turn like a washing machine full of broken glass. The timestamp showed the message was sent 3 days ago. "Can't wait until this charade is over and we can finally be together properly." Julia's so naive. She actually thinks I love her. You could have heard a pin drop in that garden. Hell, you could have heard a butterfly sneeze. 200 people who'd been chattering and celebrating just seconds before were now staring at that screen like it was showing footage of aliens landing on the White House lawn. But Julia wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting warmed up. The next slide showed hotel receipts. Dozens of them, dating back 6 months, all charged to Adrian's credit card. The Ritz-Carlton, the Four Seasons, the Grand Hyatt. This guy had taste in his adultery venues, I'll give him that. Each receipt was for a weekend when Adrian had told Julia he was attending legal conferences or meeting with potential campaign donors. Caroline's face had gone whiter than her sister's wedding dress. She was gripping the edges of her chair so hard I thought she might snap the thing in half. But she still wasn't moving, wasn't running, wasn't doing anything except staring at that screen like she was watching her own execution in high definition. Adrian, on the other hand, was starting to panic. He turned toward the AV setup, probably planning to make a run for Danny and the equipment, but I was already moving. See, Julia had positioned me perfectly for this moment. I stepped into the aisle and crossed my arms, blocking his path like a bouncer at the world's most expensive nightclub. "Don't bother," I said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "We already backed up the files. Hell, we probably uploaded them to the cloud while you were getting dressed." The third slide was a photo that made several of the older ladies in the audience audibly gasp. It wasn't pornographic. Julia had more class than that. But it was intimate enough to leave zero doubt about what was happening between Caroline and Adrian. They were in what looked like a hotel room, and Adrian was kissing Caroline's neck while she laughed with the kind of joy that should have been reserved for her own husband. Aunt Meredith, all 90 pounds of her, stood up so fast her cane hit the ground like a gavel. Her voice carried across the garden with the authority of someone who'd been the family matriarch since before most of these people were born. "Julia, is this real?" Julia's voice didn't waver, didn't shake, didn't show even a hint of the devastation she must have been feeling. "Every word, Aunt Meredith. Every photo. Every receipt. Every lie they've told us for the past 6 months." The fourth slide was a bank statement, Caroline's personal account that I'd never seen before. Withdrawals, deposits, transfers that painted a picture of a woman funding a secret relationship. Cash withdrawals of $300, $500, $800, always on the same days as Adrian's hotel receipts. She'd been paying for half their affair with money she'd somehow hidden from our joint finances. That's when I realized the full scope of what Caroline had done. She hadn't just betrayed Julia and me. She'd been living a completely double life, with secret accounts and hidden expenses and a level of deception that would have impressed professional con artists. The guests were starting to react now. Whispers were rippling through the crowd like wildfire, and people were pulling out their phones faster than gunslingers in the Old West. In the age of social media, a scandal this juicy wasn't going to stay contained to this garden for long. This was going viral before Adrian could even figure out his escape route. Victor Moore looked like someone had just told him his political dynasty was about to become a cautionary tale taught in ethics classes. The old senator was probably calculating how much damage control would cost, and whether his son's political career was salvageable or if he'd have to cut his losses and pretend Adrian was adopted. Camille Moore had gone from ice sculpture to melting snowman, her perfectly composed facade cracking like cheap paint in the heat. She was staring at the screen with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. The fifth slide was a video, security camera footage from one of their hotel encounters. Nothing explicit, just Adrian and Caroline walking into a hotel room together, holding hands like teenagers in love. But the timestamp showed it was taken on Julia's birthday, when Adrian had told her he was in court all day and Caroline had said she was shopping for Julia's present. That's when Caroline finally lost it. She leaped from her seat like someone had set her on fire, pointing at the screen and screaming loud enough to wake the dead in 3 counties. It's lies. All of it. This is fake. Julia's just jealous because Adrian chose me. And there it was, the truth finally coming out of Caroline's mouth like poison from a wound. She hadn't even tried to deny it. She'd gone straight to justifying it. In front of 200 people, including her parents, Julia's friends, and enough political connections to end Adrian's career before it started. Julia turned to face her sister with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already won the war. Chose you for what, Caroline? To be his mistress while he married me for my trust fund and family connections? Or did he promise you something more? The sixth slide answered that question. It was a recorded phone conversation. Apparently, Julia's private investigator had been thorough enough to get wiretapping involved. Adrian's voice came through the garden speakers clear as a bell. Once I'm married to Julia, I'll have access to the Hale family money and connections. Give me 2 years to establish myself politically, then we'll arrange a quiet divorce. You and I can be together openly, and I'll have the resources to run for Congress without depending on my father. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. Adrian's own words, laying out his plan to use Julia as a stepping stone to power and money, then discard her for her sister once he'd gotten what he needed. But the recording wasn't done. Caroline's voice came next, and it was like listening to a stranger wearing my wife's vocal cords. What about Marcus? He still doesn't suspect anything, but I can't keep this up forever. Living with him, pretending to love him, it's making me sick. Adrian's laugh on the recording was the kind of sound that makes you want to shower with bleach. Marcus is useful for now. He keeps you looking respectable, and his construction business gives us a perfect cover for our meetings. We'll deal with him when the time comes. Deal with me. Like I was a problem to be solved instead of a human being whose life they'd been systematically destroying. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a kind of rage so pure and focused it was almost peaceful. The seventh slide was a timeline. Months of careful documentation showing how Caroline had undermined Julia's confidence, isolated her from friends, and positioned herself as the superior choice for Adrian's affections. Text messages where Caroline told Adrian that Julia was too emotional for political life, too naive to understand his ambitions, too clingy to give him the space he needed to succeed. The eighth slide showed financial records that proved Adrian had been stealing from his law firm's client accounts to fund their affair. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, jewelry for Caroline. All of it paid for with money that belonged to other people. The guy wasn't just an adulterer. He was a white-collar criminal who'd been using stolen funds to seduce my wife. By now, half the guests were on their phones, and I could hear fragments of urgent conversations. You need to see this. It's unbelievable. The wedding just. Social media was probably melting down as photos and videos of the presentation spread faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Dr. Owen Clark looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. The poor guy was still holding his Bible, probably wondering if there was a scripture that covered this particular situation. I made a mental note to buy the man a drink later, several drinks, actually. The ninth slide was the coup de grace, a photo of Caroline and Adrian in bed together, taken just this morning while I'd been setting up chairs and Julia had been getting her hair done. They were asleep, tangled up in hotel sheets, and the timestamp showed it was taken at 9:47 a.m., less than 6 hours before Adrian was supposed to pledge his eternal love to Julia. The crowd erupted like a volcano full of designer outfits and social scandals. People were standing, pointing, arguing, and taking pictures faster than paparazzi at a celebrity meltdown. The carefully orchestrated wedding had turned into the most spectacular train wreck in the history of high society entertainment. And through it all, Julia stood at that altar in her white dress, looking like an avenging angel who'd just delivered the most perfect justice the world had ever seen. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming, wasn't breaking down. She was watching her betrayers get exactly what they deserved, and she looked absolutely radiant doing it. Caroline was still screaming, but now she was pointing at me like I was somehow responsible for her affair. Adrian had given up trying to reach the AV equipment and was just standing there like a deer in headlights, probably realizing that his political career had just been murdered in front of 200 witnesses. That's when Aunt Meredith's cane hit the ground again, and her voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "Julia, honey, you come with me. The rest of you can all go to hell." The aftermath of Julia's presentation looked like what I imagined the fall of Rome might have been like, if Rome had been populated entirely by people wearing designer outfits and carrying smartphones. The carefully choreographed elegance of the wedding had dissolved into pure chaos, with guests clustering into groups that looked suspiciously like war councils planning their next moves in the social battlefield that used to be a rose garden. The Moore family was imploding faster than a condemned building. Victor Moore had gone from distinguished senator to damage control specialist in about 30 seconds flat, his political instincts kicking in like survival reflexes. He was already on his phone, probably calling every favor he'd ever been owed and some he hadn't, trying to figure out how to contain a scandal that was already spreading across social media like wildfire in a drought. "Adrian, get in the car. Now." Victor's voice carried the kind of authority that had probably intimidated senators and judges for decades, but his son just stood there like a broken robot, staring at the screen that was still cycling through the evidence of his spectacular moral failure. Camille Moore had completely abandoned her Ice Queen persona and was crying actual tears, not the elegant, single-tear kind you see in movies, but the ugly, mascara-streaking kind that comes from watching your family's reputation get flushed down the toilet in real time. She kept looking around the crowd like she was trying to figure out which guests might still take her calls after this disaster went public. But the real show was happening with Caroline. My wife, God, I still couldn't wrap my head around that phrase, had moved from screaming denial to full-blown meltdown mode. She was rushing toward me with the kind of desperation usually reserved for people whose parachutes don't open, her eyes wild with the realization that her carefully constructed double life had just been nuked from orbit. "Marcus, say something," she pleaded, grabbing my arm like I was a life preserver, and she was drowning in an ocean of her own lies. "Tell them it's fake. Tell them this is all some kind of misunderstanding." I looked down at this woman I'd shared a bed with for 17 years, who'd cooked dinner with me, planned vacations with me, talked about growing old together with me, and I felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not heartbreak, not even disappointment, just a kind of empty clarity that comes from finally seeing someone for exactly who they really are. "You destroyed your sister's life," I said, my voice coming out steady and calm in a way that surprised me. "And mine. You want me to lie for you now? After everything you've done?" Caroline's face crumpled like a house of cards in a hurricane. "But I love you. I love Adrian. I love both of you." I was trying to find a way to make everyone happy. And there it was, the narcissistic delusion that had probably been driving her decisions all along. Caroline genuinely believed that she could have it all, that she deserved to have it all, and that everyone else should just adjust their lives to accommodate her desires. The idea that her actions might actually hurt people seemed to be a concept she'd never seriously considered. "You love us both?" I repeated, and I couldn't keep the incredulous laugh out of my voice. "Caroline, you were planning to divorce me as soon as Adrian got what he needed from Julia. That was on the recording. Your own voice saying that living with me made you sick." She collapsed onto the perfectly manicured grass like someone had cut her strings, her designer dress spreading around her like the petals of some poisonous flower. The sound she made wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite screaming. It was something raw and desperate that made several nearby guests take a step back. "I never meant for it to happen like this," she sobbed. But even in her breakdown, she was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to position herself as the victim of circumstances instead of the architect of disaster. Meanwhile, Julia was handling the chaos around her with the kind of grace that would have made diplomats jealous. She wasn't gloating or throwing insults or doing any of the things I probably would have done in her situation. She was just standing there in her wedding dress, accepting condolences and support from guests who were finally seeing the truth that had been hidden right in front of them. Aunt Meredith had appointed herself as Julia's personal bodyguard, her cane becoming a weapon of social warfare as she cleared a path through the crowd of confused and gossiping guests. The old lady was 90 pounds of pure fury wrapped in an expensive dress, and watching her in action was like seeing a masterclass in how to destroy someone's reputation using nothing but sharp words and strategic silence. 60 years I've known that girl," Aunt Meredith was saying to anyone within earshot, referring to Caroline like she was discussing a particularly disappointing investment. 60 years, and I never saw this coming. But Julia saw it. Smart girl, that one. Too smart to let herself be destroyed by jealous snakes. The guests were dividing into camps faster than politicians during election season. Team Julia was growing by the minute, as people who'd known both sisters their whole lives started remembering incidents that suddenly made a lot more sense. Caroline's subtle put-downs, her way of undermining Julia's confidence, her insistence on being involved in every aspect of Julia's relationship with Adrian. Team Caroline was, well, it was pretty much just Caroline's parents, and even they looked like they were considering switching sides. Her mother kept wringing her hands and asking how this could have happened, like adultery was some kind of natural disaster that had randomly struck their family instead of a series of deliberate choices made by her daughter. The wedding vendors were having their own crisis meetings. The photographer was still taking pictures, probably figuring this would make one hell of a portfolio piece. The caterers were standing around looking confused, like they'd prepared for a celebration and accidentally showed up to a public execution. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, which was probably for the best since there really isn't a classical piece that's appropriate for watching someone's life implode in real time. Dr. Owen Clark was still standing at the altar with his Bible, looking like he'd just witnessed the apocalypse and wasn't sure if he was supposed to perform last rites or call the police. The poor guy had probably officiated hundreds of weddings, but I was willing to bet this was his first one that included documentary evidence of felony fraud and adultery. Adrian was finally starting to move, but instead of heading toward Caroline or trying to explain himself to the crowd, he was making a beeline for the parking area. The coward was actually trying to abandon ship, leaving Caroline to face the music alone while he ran for cover like the spineless piece of garbage he'd always been. But Victor Moore wasn't having it. The old senator grabbed his son's arm with the kind of grip that probably came from decades of arm twisting in Washington politics. "You're not going anywhere until we figure out how to handle this mess," he hissed, loud enough for half the front row to hear. "Handle it?" Adrian's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Dad, they have everything. Hotel receipts, bank records, recordings. There's nothing to handle. It's over." And that's when I realized something that made me feel oddly better about the whole situation. Adrian wasn't just a cheating scumbag. He was a weak cheating scumbag. When the pressure was on, when he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of trouble, he folded faster than a lawn chair in a tornado. The crowd was thinning as guests started making their excuses and heading for the exits, probably eager to get home and start spreading the gossip before the story got away from them. But enough people remained to form a proper audience for Caroline's complete meltdown, which was reaching operatic proportions. She was alternating between begging me for forgiveness and screaming at Julia for ruining everything, like she couldn't decide which victim role would get her the most sympathy. At one point, she actually tried to claim that Julia had somehow seduced Adrian away from her, which was so backwards it would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Julia's always been jealous of me, Caroline wailed to anyone who would listen. She couldn't stand that Adrian loved me more than her. She made up all of this to destroy my happiness. But the evidence was still cycling on that screen, and Caroline's version of events required the kind of mental gymnastics that would have impressed Olympic judges. You can't fake hotel receipts from 6 months ago. You can't doctor bank statements that detailed. You can't fabricate recordings that clearly showed who was pursuing whom. Julia finally spoke, her voice cutting through Caroline's theatrical breakdown like a knife through butter. Caroline, just stop. Please. You've embarrassed yourself enough for one day. And that's when I saw something that made everything click into place. Caroline wasn't just upset about being caught. She was furious that Julia had outsmarted her. The little sister, the naive one, the one who was supposed to be too sweet and trusting to see what was happening right in front of her, had played Caroline like a violin and orchestrated her downfall with surgical precision. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Caroline wasn't the smartest person in the room. Julia had beaten her at her own game, and Caroline's ego couldn't handle the reality that she'd been outmaneuvered by someone she'd always considered intellectually inferior. Standing there in that ruined wedding garden, watching my wife have a public breakdown while her sister stood tall in a dress she'd never get to wear again, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for Caroline and me. That ship had sailed, caught fire, and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. But hope that maybe, just maybe, the good guys could win sometimes. Julia caught my eye across the chaos and smiled. Not with triumph or malice, but with something that looked suspiciously like gratitude. And for the first time since I'd opened that den door this morning, I smiled back. The wedding that never happened became the scandal that never ended. By the time the sun set over Riverside Estate that evening, #Wedding of Deception was trending on Twitter, and amateur videographers who'd captured Julia's presentation were getting offers from news outlets and talk shows. It turns out that watching high society eat itself alive is pretty much America's favorite sport, right after football and complaining about politicians. But the immediate aftermath was just the opening act. The real show started when the lawyers got involved. Adrian's theft from his law firm's client accounts, which Julia's private investigator had documented with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant, didn't just cost him his job. It earned him a federal investigation that moved faster than celebrity gossip. Turns out that stealing money to fund your affair with your fiancé's sister is the kind of thing that gets the FBI's attention, especially when one of the victims is a federal judge who doesn't appreciate being robbed to pay for hotel rooms. Within 2 weeks, Adrian was facing charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and about 6 other felonies that carried sentences longer than most marriages last. His political career didn't just die. It was cremated, scattered to the winds, and forgotten faster than last season's fashion trends. Victor Moore spent more on legal fees trying to keep his son out of prison than most people spend on houses. But even senatorial influence has its limits when the evidence is that overwhelming. The Moore family reputation went from political dynasty to cautionary tale in record time. Camille had to resign from half a dozen charity boards when it became clear that being associated with the Moore name was social suicide. Victor managed to keep his own career intact, but just barely, and only by throwing Adrian under so many buses that the kid probably qualified for frequent flyer miles. Caroline's downfall was more gradual, but no less complete. The divorce proceedings were about as friendly as a cage match between hungry wolves, especially after my lawyer discovered the secret bank accounts and hidden assets that Caroline had been using to fund her affair. Turns out that when you're systematically stealing from your husband to pay for hotel rooms with your sister's fiancé, the family court judges tend to take a dim view of your character. She lost everything. The house, my house, the one I'd built with my own hands, went to me in the settlement. Half her inheritance from her grandmother got diverted to Julia as compensation for the emotional damage. Her car, her jewelry, her designer clothes. All of it got liquidated to pay for legal fees and restitution. But the worst part for Caroline was the social exile. In a community where reputation is currency, she'd filed for bankruptcy in the worst possible way. Her own parents barely spoke to her anymore, and her friends disappeared faster than free food at a construction site. She ended up moving 3 states away, taking a job at some insurance company where nobody knew her story. Last I heard, she was living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old Honda, which would have been fine for most people, but was probably hell for someone who'd spent her whole life believing she deserved better than everyone else. Julia, on the other hand, emerged from the wreckage like a phoenix wearing designer clothes. The sympathy and support she received from the community was overwhelming. Apparently, everyone loves a woman who refuses to be a victim and fights back with style and intelligence. She got job offers from law firms who'd heard about her investigative skills, marriage proposals from men who appreciated a woman who could handle herself in a crisis, and enough interview requests to keep her busy for months. But she turned most of them down. "I'm done being defined by other people's choices," she told me when we met for coffee about a month after the wedding that wasn't. "I want to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone's perfect wife or someone's naive little sister." We were sitting in this little cafe downtown, the kind of place that serves coffee in actual ceramic mugs instead of paper cups, and doesn't charge you extra for basic human dignity. Julia looked different somehow. Not just because she'd cut her hair shorter and was wearing jeans instead of the flowery dresses Caroline had always told her looked more appropriate. She looked stronger, sharper, like someone who'd been through fire and decided she liked the person who came out the other side. "I keep thinking about what you said that morning," she continued, stirring sugar into her coffee with the kind of deliberate precision that meant she was working up to something important. "About standing up for yourself, not just for me." I remembered that conversation, though it felt like it had happened in another lifetime. Yeah, well, turns out we were both getting screwed over by the same people. Made sense to work together. Julia smiled, and it was the first completely genuine expression I'd seen from her since before everything went to hell. "Marcus, you need to know something. I wasn't just standing up for myself that day. I was standing up for you too. What they were doing to you. Talking about you like you were disposable, planning to deal with you when the time came. It made me sick. That hit me harder than I'd expected. In all the chaos and drama of exposing Caroline and Adrian, I'd sometimes forgotten that Julia had put her own neck on the line to protect me from people who were supposed to love us both. She could have just taken her evidence and left town, started over somewhere else where nobody knew her story. Instead, she'd chosen to fight, not just for herself, but for both of us. Why? I asked, because it was the question that had been bugging me for weeks. You barely knew me before all this happened. Why risk everything to help someone who was basically just your sister's husband? Julia was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the street where normal people were going about their normal lives, probably dealing with normal problems like traffic and grocery lists instead of adultery and federal investigations. "Because you were the only person in that whole mess who was exactly who you appeared to be," she said finally. Caroline was playing 3 different roles depending on who she was talking to. Adrian was lying to everyone about everything. Even I was pretending to be the naive little sister while I was actually building a case that would destroy them both. She turned back to me, and her eyes had that same intensity I'd seen right before she'd brought down the house at her own wedding. "But you were just Marcus. Honest, straightforward, exactly what you seemed to be. In a world full of people playing games, that was like finding a unicorn." I almost choked on my coffee. "Julia, I spent 17 years married to a woman who was lying to me about everything. If I'm so good at reading people, how did I miss that?" "Because you loved her," Julia said simply. "Love makes us blind to things we don't want to see. But that doesn't make you stupid, Marcus. It makes you human." We sat there for a while, drinking our coffee and watching the world go by outside. It was one of those perfect fall afternoons where the air is crisp and the leaves are just starting to change colors, the kind of day that makes you believe in fresh starts and second chances. "So what's next for you?" I asked, because I was genuinely curious. Julia had this whole new life stretching out in front of her, free from Caroline's manipulation and Adrian's lies, and I found myself hoping she'd make the most of it. "I'm thinking about going back to school," she said. "Maybe law school this time, for real. Turns out I'm pretty good at building cases and presenting evidence." "Who knew?" I laughed, because the understatement was so massive it was almost offensive. Julia, you took down a lawyer and a career politician using nothing but homework and determination. I think you might be selling yourself short. Maybe, she agreed. But I want to do it right this time. Not because someone else thinks I should, not because it fits into someone else's plan for my life, but because it's what I want to do. That's when I realized something that probably should have been obvious weeks ago. Julia wasn't just surviving what Caroline and Adrian had done to her. She was thriving. The betrayal that would have destroyed most people had somehow set her free to become whoever she was meant to be all along. What about you? She asked. Any plans for your post-Caroline life? I thought about that for a minute. The house felt different now, emptier but also cleaner somehow, like I'd finally gotten rid of something that had been slowly poisoning the air. I'd been thinking about selling it, starting over somewhere else. But lately I'd been wondering if maybe what I needed wasn't a new place, but a new perspective on the place I already had. I'm thinking about expanding the business, I said, surprising myself with the words. Maybe taking on some bigger projects, hiring a few more guys. Caroline always said I was thinking too small, but she meant it as an insult. Maybe she was right, just not in the way she thought. Julia raised her coffee mug in a mock toast. To thinking bigger. To thinking clearer. I countered, and we clinked ceramic against ceramic like we were sealing some kind of deal. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt lighter. Not just because Caroline was gone, though that was definitely part of it, but because I'd learned something important about myself during the whole mess. I'd learned that I could stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. I'd learned that I could be the kind of person who helps someone else fight back against injustice, even when it would have been easier to just walk away. Betrayal had destroyed a wedding, ruined a family, and sent a would-be politician to federal prison. But it had also built something stronger in its place. The truth about who we really were when everything else was stripped away. And sitting there in that cafe with Julia, drinking coffee and planning futures that nobody else had designed for us, that truth felt pretty damn good. If you can't handle me sleeping with the CEO and your friends, then leave. They're real men. Not impotent, my wife snapped. I smiled coldly. As you wish. The next morning, my 3 friends, my wife and her CEO landed in the ER with matching symptoms. Then the doctor entered the room. Guys, this is hard to say, but you know what's funny about loyalty? It's like buying insurance for a house that's already burning down. You keep paying premiums, thinking you're protected, while the flames are literally licking at your ankles. My name is Michael Harland, and at 36 years old, I'd spent the better part of my adult life believing that loyalty was the golden ticket to a decent existence. Turns out, I was about as wrong as a GPS trying to navigate the Bermuda Triangle. For 8 years, I'd been working sanitation for the city of Chicago. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, glamorous, right? Nothing says living the dream, like emptying trash cans at 5 a.m. while dodging used condoms and half-eaten pizza slices that probably violated several health codes. But here's the kicker that nobody knew, not even my wife. While I was collecting garbage by day, I was quietly building a crypto fortune that would make most Wall Street bros weep into their overpriced lattes. See, back in 2015, when Bitcoin was cheaper than a decent bottle of wine, I started throwing every spare dollar I could scrape together into various cryptocurrencies. While everyone else was laughing at digital monopoly money, I was studying charts, reading white papers, and basically becoming a financial ninja in my spare time. The beauty of being invisible, which, let's face it, is exactly what you become when you're wearing a city sanitation uniform, is that nobody pays attention to what you're doing with your money. They just assume you don't have any. By 2023, my portfolio was sitting pretty at around $4 million. Not bad for a guy whose job title officially read Waste Management Technician, huh? But did I go around bragging about it? Did I buy a Ferrari and start acting like some crypto bro douchebag? Hell no. I kept my mouth shut, drove my beat-up Honda Civic, and continued living like a normal human being. Because that's what loyal people do. They don't rock the boat, they don't show off, and they sure as hell don't make their partners feel insecure about money. Which brings me to my wife, Celeste. Beautiful, ambitious, and with the emotional depth of a puddle in the Sahara Desert. We'd been married for 6 years, and for most of that time, I genuinely believed we were building something together. She was working on her influencer career, Because apparently having opinions about skincare routines and posting thirst traps disguised as lifestyle content is a legitimate profession now, while I provided the steady income and emotional support. Classic arrangement, right? The dependable husband holding down the fort while the wife chases her dreams. Except somewhere along the way, chasing dreams became chasing other men's dicks, and apparently I was too stupid to notice. Or maybe I was just too damn loyal to want to see it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in March. I remember it was Tuesday because that's trash pickup day in our neighborhood, and I'd just gotten home from a particularly brutal shift involving what I can only describe as a crime scene disguised as a dumpster behind a seafood restaurant. I was tired, I smelled like low tide mixed with regret, and all I wanted was a shower and maybe some leftover Chinese food. Instead, I walked into what felt like an episode of Jerry Springer directed by Satan himself. Celeste was sitting at our kitchen table, phone in hand, looking like she'd just won the lottery and simultaneously discovered the cure for cancer. That should have been my first red flag. Nobody looks that pleased with themselves unless they're about to drop a bomb that would make Hiroshima look like a firecracker. "We need to talk," she said, which in married couple speak translates to "you're about to get emotionally waterboarded, so buckle up, buttercup." I sat down across from her, still in my work clothes, probably leaving a faint aroma of garbage and broken dreams in my wake. "What's up, babe?" She looked me dead in the eye, and I mean dead, like she was staring at a particularly disappointing piece of roadkill, and delivered the line that would change everything. "If you can't handle me sleeping with the CEO and your friends, then leave. They're real men, not impotent." Now, let me pause here for a second to address that last part. Impotent? Really? That was her big finishing move? I mean, if you're going to gut a man like a fish, at least be creative about it. Impotent is what middle schoolers use when they run out of actually hurtful things to say. But the real kicker wasn't the insult itself. It was the casual way she dropped the bomb about sleeping with multiple people I trusted. The CEO, my friends, plural, as in more than one. For about 30 seconds, I just sat there, processing this information like a computer trying to run Crisis on Windows 95. Part of me wanted to ask for clarification. Which friends, exactly? How long had this been going on? Did they have a group chat where they compared notes about my performance in bed? But another part of me, the part that had been quietly building a crypto empire while taking out the trash, recognized this moment for what it really was. An opportunity. See, here's what Celeste didn't understand about loyalty. It's not weakness. It's not being a pushover or a doormat or whatever other furniture-based metaphor she probably used when talking about me to her new boyfriends. Loyalty is strategic patience. It's gathering information, building resources, and waiting for exactly the right moment to make your move. And brother, she had just given me that moment on a silver platter. Instead of yelling, instead of crying, instead of doing any of the dramatic bullshit she was probably expecting, I smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the kind of smile you'd see on a shark right before it turns a surfer into an all-you-can-eat buffet. "As you wish," I said, standing up from the table with the kind of calm that probably should have terrified her. But Celeste was too busy basking in what she thought was her moment of triumph to notice that she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent years learning how to be invisible, patient, and ruthlessly efficient. That night, while she was probably texting her new boyfriends about how she'd finally gotten rid of the dead weight, I sat in my home office and began making lists. Not angry, emotional lists, methodical, military precision lists. Names, addresses, schedules, weaknesses, financial situations, social media accounts, business relationships. My military training from my 20s started whispering in the back of my head like an old friend offering advice. Surveillance, documentation, patience, strategy. Celeste thought she was getting rid of a weak, impotent husband. What she'd actually done was unleash someone who'd spent years quietly learning how to wage war in the shadows. And the best part? She had absolutely no idea what was coming. You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie and the main character decides to investigate the creepy noise in the basement? That moment where you're screaming at the screen, "Don't go down there, you absolute moron." Well, turns out I was living in my own personal horror flick, except instead of a basement full of demons, I had a life full of backstabbing assholes who I'd stupidly considered family. It wasn't just Celeste. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too clean. like finding out your dentist has been overcharging you versus discovering your entire medical team has been harvesting your organs while you sleep. The betrayal ran deeper than a Kardashian's fake tan, and it involved pretty much every person I'd trusted over the past decade. Let me paint you a picture of my personal Judas collection, starting with Dean Matthews. This guy was supposed to be my brother from another mother, the kind of friend you call when you need help moving a couch or hiding a body. Not that I'd ever actually hidden a body, but you get the metaphor. Dean owned CrossFit Revolution downtown, one of those places where people pay obscene amounts of money to lift heavy things and then post about it on Instagram like they've just discovered fire. I'd met Dean 6 years ago when I was going through what I now recognize as a midlife crisis disguised as a fitness journey. You know the drill. 30-year-old man suddenly realizes he's shaped like a deflated balloon animal and decides to do something about it. Dean was the trainer who helped me transform from guy who gets winded walking upstairs to guy who can actually see his own feet without a mirror. We bonded over shared workouts, weekend barbecues, and what I thought was genuine friendship. Turns out, Dean's definition of brotherhood included screwing my wife behind my back while I was out collecting garbage to pay for the gym membership that was keeping me in shape for her enjoyment. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a protein shake. Then there was Tyler Morrison, my crypto trading buddy who I'd helped get started in the digital currency game back when he thought blockchain was something you used to secure a bicycle. This dude owed me everything, and I mean everything. When he was living in his mom's basement, subsisting on ramen noodles and false hope, I was the one who walked him through his first Bitcoin purchase. I shared my research, my strategies, my hard-earned knowledge about market patterns and trading psychology. Fast forward to 2023, and Tyler was pulling in 6 figures a year trading crypto, living in a downtown loft that probably cost more per month than most people's annual salary. He'd transformed from basement-dwelling neckbeard to slick financial wizard, complete with the kind of designer wardrobe that screams, "I have more money than sense." And how did he thank me for jump-starting his entire career? By joining my wife's little harem while probably using profits from strategies I taught him to buy her expensive gifts. The third musketeer in this circus of betrayal was Malik Rodriguez, a real estate hustler who I'd literally saved from financial ruin 3 years ago. Malik was the kind of guy who could sell ice to Eskimos and somehow make them feel grateful for the privilege. He specialized in flipping houses in up-and-coming neighborhoods, riding the wave of gentrification like some kind of capitalist surfer. But even the smoothest talkers sometimes bite off more than they can chew, and Malik had gotten himself into a situation involving a property deal gone wrong, some very unhappy investors, and what I suspected were connections to people who solved business disputes with crowbars rather than lawyers. When he came to me, desperate and scared, I didn't hesitate to lend him 50 grand from my crypto stash to make his problems disappear. Did I ask for a contract? Nope. Did I demand collateral? Hell no. Because that's what friends do for each other, right? They help without keeping score. They trust without documentation. They believe in each other even when logic suggests otherwise. Malik paid me back within 6 months, plus interest, and I thought that was the end of it. Just a friend helping a friend through a rough patch. What I didn't realize was that I'd apparently purchased a premium membership to the Let's All Bang Michael's Wife Club, with Malik as one of the founding members. And then there was the ring leader himself, Victor Langford, CEO of Apex Fitness Empire, a guy who'd built his fortune selling overpriced gym equipment and supplements to people desperate enough to believe that six-pack abs could be purchased rather than earned. Victor was the kind of man who wore suits that cost more than most people's cars, drove a Lamborghini like it was a civic duty, and treated women like collectible trading cards. He was also Celeste's boss. Technically speaking, she'd started working for Apex as a brand ambassador, which as far as I could tell involved posting workout videos and sports bras that could double as dental floss and attending company events where she smiled pretty for investors. It was supposed to be her big break into the influencer world, her chance to build the kind of personal brand that would make her independently wealthy and famous. What I didn't know was that Victor's hiring process apparently included a very thorough orientation period that had nothing to do with company policies and everything to do with his personal entertainment. He saw my wife as just another trophy to add to his collection,